Good morning, everyone. Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us here at Web Summit. I heard the term yesterday that we are at peak Silicon Valley. If that's the case, why do we not have a string of European tech titans? So let's kick it off with the conversation on that. Nicolas, you have helped create a French unicorn with BlaBlaCar. Is there a main barrier to growth here in Europe?
Well, I think we should start by talking about what we have in Europe. We have 500 million consumers in Europe, and if you look at any sort of B2C vertical, there are no reason whatsoever we're not creating large companies in Europe. I mean, we eat as much food as the US, we drive as many cars, we use as many phones, and so on and so on. The main challenge, if I look at the story of BlaBlaCar, how we went to being a French company to a European company and now being even outside of Europe, it's how difficult it is to set up shop in every country in Europe, right? So there is a notion of, you've done pretty well in France, you have consumers, you have an operation. If you want to go and set up shop in Germany, you don't just focus on consumer and tech expansion, you need to focus on regulation, you need to focus on labor law, you need to focus on tax issues, and so on and so on. So I think that's probably one of the issues we need to solve. It's probably like, how do we simplify some of those regulations in Europe so that it's easier to scale? I think the rest, in terms of, I'm sure we'll talk about financing, but in terms of financing, I think it's much better than a few years back. In terms of talent, I think we have the talents in Europe. So it's more like ease of scaling is still a challenge.
Well, good luck getting harmonization on all those issues. Just tax, you might be lucky with that as the first outcome, let alone labor. Klaus, let me bring you in, because you are a venture capitalist based in Zurich, an early backer of the likes of Facebook and Skype, among other major technology companies. So tell us why you think there might be a barrier versus what's happening in the United States.
So I think we need to be aware that the ecosystems have a total different maturity. So the US system is 25 years older than the European one. And if you look at all the companies that have been founded after 1975 in the US and are now listed, 42% of them have been venture financed, and 63% of the combined market cap lies with these venture financed companies. So this is going to happen the next 25 years in Europe. But we had to catch up in terms of ecosystem, and ecosystem describes a synergistic coexistence between different stakeholders that are necessary to develop this ecosystem. So meaning business angels, meaning entrepreneurs, meaning pattern of thinking that has to develop in order to have the right aspirations, and later stage funding. I think we have made incredible advances in the mentality of the entrepreneurs in the early stage financing. And my biggest worry is not so much from the view that these companies exist, but more from a view of the governance for Europe. How do we keep the BlaBlaCars and the Spotifys and the big companies as European domiciled companies in Europe? Yeah.
Rather than being bought out by American counterparts.
Yeah, bought out is the obvious threat. There is an implicit threat that if you are not able in Europe to mobilize money to do the later stage rounds in these big companies, then they all get financed by Chinese or US companies, meaning that these VCs then dominate the limited part, the governance of these companies, the supervisory boards, and de facto they then are basically ruled outside of Europe.
Diego, your background's fascinating. You've worked for Apple in Europe, you've worked for Amazon, and now you're working with the Italian government on a 2-year sabbatical away from Amazon. So give us your perspective.
Well, I'm 1 year through my new tenure, and I've seen things that you humans can't imagine. But the angle I'm going to offer here is, which is obviously part of my job, is not the regulation side of the companies, but it's more like the duty the governments have to become modern, simple through digitalization. I think it's an opportunity for Europe, for many of the European countries. Some are more than others. But the point is that it's hard to imagine a digitalized economy when the main decision maker, the main policy maker, is not digitalized. And with digitalization, obviously, it implies simplification. I think digitalizing governments is going to be a huge forcing function to simplify rules. I mean, I just heard the comments, right? You want to open a business in 25 different locations in Italy, you probably have to ask for 25 different kind of permits. Do you want to digitalize that, or do you want at the same time simplify the process? And do you want to also think about a European situations where if you are a European business, given the fact that each single market very seldom has the critical mass to develop unicorns, how can you make it simpler to open a point of sales in Germany, as in Sweden, as in Italy?
But what you and Nicolas are both talking about is simply not going to happen. Simplification of systems from governments, and we've got a regional push, nationalistic push. There is no genuine discussion taking place across Europe to have harmonization on labor rules. Tax is a challenge, let alone labor laws. I'm on Klaus's point that if you get an ecosystem happening, you might have more luck, but what you both are calling for, we may as well just pack up and go home.
Well, I think you need several things, right? So you need the ecosystem we talked about. On that, I would say I'm getting more and more optimistic. So if I look at our history, right? So we started to fundraise in 2010, essentially, 2009, 2010. Very tough time. And at that time, when we said we want to scale BlaBlaCar all over Europe, it was very hard to find VCs in Europe that would buy the story. I think it has changed. I mean, Klaus can probably comment on that, but I think today you see more and more VCs in Europe, in France, in the UK, in Germany, everywhere in Europe that would back those stories. So the ecosystem is evolving. It's still very young compared to Silicon Valley, but it's evolving. In terms of regulation, I think we've done good things. We talked about roaming just earlier. Roaming clearly is a huge help. The fact that you have no roaming charges. The fact that today I can employ in Paris anyone from Europe without a visa is a huge help. So I think it's going to be step by step. The question is, how do we accelerate that change towards, yes, tax, labor law, and some regulation? And perhaps also, how do we, in a way, either give no power to Brussels or more power to Brussels? And today, part of my issue is I feel a bit in the middle, where I go spend some time in Brussels, where people are very supportive of what we do, but then I cannot really action that into, okay, go help me in Spain, go help me in France.
Or in Italy.
Or in Italy. So I think we need to accelerate that process, essentially.
And let me share the optimism. Obviously, you have to be optimistic in this situation and look at the glasses half full, or at least 25% full. When I started, my job, and I created this digital transformation team, which is 25 people, 20 technologists. I was appointed by the previous Prime Minister of Italy, Matteo Renzi. I've seen obviously as a political appointment, but after 1 year, we have the respect of all the political parties. I start seeing some signals, and maybe I'm an illusionist here, that digital transformation and simplification is not seen as a one-party approach, but it's something that is a must. Whether from the left, the center, or the right, how can you doubt on the fact that you need to simplify and digitalize the government?
Before we move off regulation, I just want to bring you and Klaus on the fight that is brewing between European regulators and US regulators, Silicon Valley. Recent rulings against the likes of Apple and Amazon on tax grounds, Google on antitrust. Europe says it's about fair play. The Americans say it's protectionism. Can you label what's happening here and why it's relevant?
I can only give you my perspective as an outsider. I do believe that the power that is assembled in the operating systems is so high, and it touches, since these are operating systems, so different fields of operations, that it is not a problem if everybody respects the platform neutrality. The moment the platform neutrality is not respected, then the only way to make that happen is by political interference. So I think political interference would just be a reaction on a behavior in a hopefully free market and free competition. But from everything that I see, I feel, for example, that Spotify is not in the Google Voice Hub. I think that has nothing to do with a free platform.
It's one thing to have industry regulation or companies regulating themselves, but in this environment, we all know how quickly the technology is moving. Artificial intelligence, algorithms are coming into the dynamic as well. So doesn't it make the challenge even harder for regulators to keep up?
Yeah, well, I think we need to be a little bit more courageous. I think if we look to China, that they have done, some call it protectionism, some call it active industry policy, that they have done that over a certain period of time until their companies reached a size that they could take a normal competition with everybody else, has finally led to the fact that they have an industry now and have a competitive industry. And if you see the perception that they also have, that they say, okay, artificial intelligence is important, we implement it in a 5-year plan, we give our data to these startups in a very open way, like Alibaba gets all the CCTV data to predict the traffic flows in cities. This is something we could easily do, yeah, but it is, we need to be courageous on the political side, and that is not always the currency that the politicians play with.
Yeah, just to jump on that very quickly, I think if you have strong political will, and the example of China is actually very relevant, if you have strong political will in countries in Europe or in Europe, actually regulation can be very powerful. So if we decide in Europe that we want to be the place for autonomous vehicle, we want to be the place for the sharing economy, we want to be the place for AI, then regulation actually could help companies like ours essentially to scale faster. And you're not going to bang your head against the wall trying to convince regulators that what you do is right because it's part of a political agenda. I think that's one thing we're missing. And again, that's where either you have more power in Brussels or you don't.
Diego?
Yeah, the complementary to this, and answering directly your question, is governments must build more skilled competence on technology in general. Now, that doesn't mean they should do everything by themselves, but today the level of lack of competence is scary. And there must be efforts and programs to start having that level of computer scientists, data scientists within the government and driving it. And it's not impossible. I mean, I keep saying in Italy, we need more politicians that are computer scientists than lawyers. We need more computer scientists than lawyers. But it is happening in China, by the way. I mean, at my previous job, I'd been going to China 50 times, and I was always talking to government officials. They're extremely qualified. I mean, they're capable of attracting talents. Obviously, it's a different system, but you can feel the fact that there is a lot of technical competence also within the governments.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. It's a conditio sine qua non, because if you do not have the knowledge, how will you judge the situations? And the other point to his remark is, for example, let's say the drone system. The drone operating systems are 60 to 65% dominated by DJI right now, right? But in Europe, we will fly around with drones. Companies will fly around with drones. So does it make sense to embrace DJI? Yeah, since drones are always online, probably every movement of every drone of every company, wherever it flies to in Europe, is live challenged back to China, and they have a complete flight pattern. Well, I'm not sure if that is the thing that we in Europe would want to like. Yeah, so because then you are like an open book. So this is a typical thing for regulation, where we would want to have our own operating systems basically and control the amount of data that we give out.
Let's flip the conversation around with the time we have left and talk about it from the bottom-up perspective from companies. The type of companies created in Europe, are they more B2B rather than consumer businesses? Is that why we don't have this sort of huge tech titan culture here in Europe? Is it the type of businesses being created that could be the issue?
I can jump in being on the other side. I think that one of the biggest changes I've seen when I moved from Europe, even from Italy to Seattle. Obviously, Italy and Seattle, they're a little bit too extreme, so my examples could be exaggerated there. It's such a different customer focus. I mean, the point is that most of the companies, the names that you've mentioned, they have successful because they've solved customer problems, and most of the times, customer needs, not even customers need it. So, I mean, if that means it's not enough B2C focused, could be, although, BlaBlaCar, I was telling him that my sister-in-law is her biggest fan because he solved her problems of mobility. So if you think about it, Yux is another example. They're a customer-focused company, and they are very successful European unicorns.
Does it come back to the funding and to the numbers in a company? I mean, there are reports suggesting unicorns in Europe have a higher average of revenue than those in the US, suggesting that investors on the other side of the Atlantic are willing to pump more money into support a business and have more red ink for many years to come, whereas in Europe they want to see the rewards right now.
I think, maybe I can jump in here. There are two observations. I think it's always a function of the size of a fund. If you have a 1.4 billion fund, let's as an example, you can easily do a 70 million bet, write it off, and nobody would care. So doing this kind of bets, you do a lot of them, and the statistical mathematics works in you create a lot of chances for these companies to over-excel. And if you lose some, doesn't matter, because the others, because you have given them so much money, go on a trajectory that they get so big. That means this kind of mechanism is totally different. For me, what is totally shocking, one number is, we need to, in Europe, have the money to take part. Out of the 30 big companies, platforms in the world that are not listed yet, so the Xiaomi's, the Didi Kuxing's, the European VCs took part in 14% of the financing rounds. They invested 1.9% of the money and are represented with 1.4% in the cap tables. So meaning we don't happen. We simply don't happen. And if you want to control your destiny in Europe, you either do it by having a representation in the boards or by regulation. So, and both has room for improvement.
Nicolas, when's BlaBlaCar coming to the market?
We're not in a hurry to go into the market, but maybe to quickly go back on your earlier point, right? I think we do lots of B2C in Europe. It's just we see them less because historically we've done what I call like the single country winners. So we do like, the eBay of Germany, we do the Amazon of this, and we tend to stay like within a single country. So if you think of like the top tech Germany, you look at like the top B2C companies in Germany, they're probably not very well known in France or in the UK or in Spain. So I think that's the thing we need to crack. You have a few examples, like Spotify obviously is a great example. I think we are becoming one of these examples because we are number one in Germany, number one in France, number one in Spain. So I think the ambition of entrepreneurs has changed. I think investors in Europe start to understand that, or at least like the last few years, I think they started to understand that. So it's easier to raise like today 10, 20, 50 million in Europe. Back in 2010, frankly, raising 10 was a bit of a miracle when you had like no revenue. So I think it's changing. So if that trend continues, it's going to be interesting. What's going to be pretty telling for Europe is whenever we get the next downturn, and history has showed that typically you always have like downturns. We'll see how many of the European unicorns and the European companies actually survive and go to the market, and how resilient is the ecosystem. So I think for me the real test for Europe is probably going to be in the next few years. And to see like how many of the Spotify, BlaBlaCar, and the large companies actually indeed go to the market and become their own thing.
We're out of time. Just a quick message from each of you to take away. 5 years' time, will anything have changed? Yes or no?
Yes, I think the European ecosystem is going to be a lot stronger in 5 years.
Klaus?
Yes, more polarization, but definitely stronger.
I
Diego?
totally agree. We'll even have better government.
Optimistic messages. Thank you very much. And Nicolas, Klaus, Diego, thank you for your time here at Web Summit.